The wind reached Mercer's Run before the bad winter did. Old men felt it first in their joints. Horses turned their backs to the north fence lines. Even the dogs stopped sleeping outside after dark. 3 days after Elias Whitlock was buried beneath frozen ground, his entire life was already being divided apart. And Gideon Whitlock, the oldest brother, moved fast. He took control of the family sawmill before their father's grave had even settled. He secured the logging accounts through ownership papers most people in town had never seen before. By the end of the week, even the Whitlock house belonged to him after the local bank sided quietly in his favor. No shouting, no courtroom, just signatures, influence, and winter closing in too quickly for anyone to fight back. Vern Whitlock stood in the yard, watching strangers carry his father's tools into another man's wagon, while cold wind swept through Mercer's Run like something searching for weakness. What remained for him fit inside one hand. A cracked deed. 40 acres on Black Elk Pass, the Wind Teeth. Land so brutal that even trappers avoided sleeping there during heavy snow months. Beside him stood Clara Whitlock, his wife, looking toward the distant ridge without speaking. Dark clouds hung above the mountains already. And somewhere in that moment, Vern understood the truth all at once. His brother had not given him land. He had given him a place people expected him to die. But before this story reaches the winter that buried entire roofs beneath ice and snow, wait until you see what Vern Whitlock built beneath that mountain. If you enjoy frontier survival stories, forgotten old-world skills, and practical ways people survived against impossible winters, subscribe and stay with the channel, because those mountains had already learned how to survive long before men ever did. The wagon climbed slowly toward Black Elk Pass, its wheels grinding over frozen stone and old ruts hardened by years of mountain runoff. The higher Vern and Clara traveled, the less the land resembled anything meant for human comfort. Snow still clung to the shaded slopes even before true winter had arrived. Wind screamed through the granite cuts with a sound almost human at times. The cedar and tamarack trees did not rise tall there. They crawled low against the earth, twisted by decades of punishment. Nothing on the ridge stood proudly for long. Clara pulled her coat tighter as another gust hit the wagon broadside. Does anybody actually live up here? Vern studied the woven branches overhead, where several bent cedars had grown through one another instead of apart. The trees bowed beneath the wind, but none of them had broken. No, he said quietly. Nobody ever tried to understand it. The Wind Teeth did not feel empty. It felt hostile, deliberate, like a place that tested every living thing before allowing it to stay. By late afternoon, another wagon appeared behind them. Gideon Whitlock rode at the front beside Ephraim Cutter, the broad-shouldered logging foreman who had spent most of his life cutting timber in the northern hills. Gideon climbed down first, boots sinking into the thin frost. "I'll make this simple," he said. $35. A train ticket south. I can get you warehouse work in Duluth before winter closes the lines. Ephraim looked over the ridge and gave a dry laugh. First hard snow'll bury you alive up here. The wind shoved against all four men as if the mountain itself were listening. Gideon pointed toward the frozen slope beyond the trees. Father left you this land because nobody else wanted it. Clara said nothing. Her hands stayed folded tightly beneath her coat. Vern unfolded the old deed once more. The paper shook lightly in the wind. Then he folded it again. No. The answer was calm, short, final. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Gideon climbed back into the wagon, anger hidden beneath cold disappointment. Ephraim gave the ridge one last look before turning the horses downhill. The sound of the wagon faded slowly into the valley below, and the mountain wind moved in to fill the silence they left behind. By nightfall, the temperature dropped hard enough to freeze the mud along the wagon tracks into stiff ridges of ice. Vern and Clara had no cabin waiting for them on Black Elk Pass. No walls, no stove, no stacked firewood drying beneath a roof. Only an old canvas tarp, a hand axe, 2 blankets, a strip of salt bacon, and a tinderbox wrapped in oilcloth. The wind came harder after sunset. It hammered across the ridge in long, violent bursts. bending the tamarack tops and carrying loose snow through the trees like white smoke. Vern led Clara deeper into a thick stand of cedar where the branches had grown low and tangled together over many years. The difference was immediate. Outside the canopy, the wind roared. Under it, the air barely moved. He crouched beside the frozen ground and struck sparks into a nest of dry bark. A small fire caught weakly, then steadied. The tarp snapped and strained several times through the night, nearly tearing free when the gusts shifted direction. But the flames beneath the cedar canopy never fully died. That was the first thing Vern truly learned about the ridge. The mountain did not protect anything out of kindness, but there were places where it struck less hard. Sometime after midnight, Clara finally fell asleep beside the fire with a blanket pulled to her chin. For the first time in days, the wind was no longer hitting her face. The next several days were spent walking the ridge, instead of fighting it. Vern moved slowly across Black Elk Pass with the patience of a surveyor laying rail through unknown country. He studied old snowdrifts hardened like dirty stone beneath the trees. He watched how cedar trunks leaned away from certain cuts in the granite. He noticed moss growing thickest along the calmer sides of the rock shoulders where the wind struck less directly. Nothing on the mountain was random. Even the damage followed patterns. Clara watched him crouch beside a narrow ridge break one afternoon and toss a handful of cold ash into the air. The powder lifted, twisted once, then vanished sideways through a hidden current between the stones. That was when Vern saw it. A shallow hollow behind a granite rise where old drift lines sat deeper than anywhere else nearby. Snow collected there. Wind passed over it instead of through it. The place was quieter, warmer, almost hidden. The wind already built half a shelter here, Vern said softly, and for the first time, the ridge no longer looked empty to him. That evening, Clara sat near the fire, rubbing warmth back into her hands, while snow drifted quietly through the upper trees. She remembered something Elias Whitlock had once said, after returning from a fur run near the Canadian border many winters earlier. A trapper had survived 5 nights buried beneath a snowdrift after losing his cabin in a storm. Elias claimed the man nearly suffocated from wind exposure before he ever froze. Snow, packed thick enough, had trapped heat better than timber walls. Vern listened without speaking. Then his eyes lifted slowly toward the cedar canopy overhead. Old snow still rested in the bent branches from an earlier storm. The limbs sagged low under the weight, woven through one another so tightly that no single branch carried the burden alone. None of them had snapped. Vern stared at them for a long time. Snow insulation, stable earth temperature, living wood that bent instead of resisting. The shape of the idea arrived quietly after that. Not a cabin above the ridge. A shelter inside it, half buried in the slope, roofed with woven cedar, covered by the very snow other men feared. For the first time, Vern understood something the mountain had been demonstrating all along. Nothing up there survived winter by standing rigid against it. The work began the following morning. Vern searched the lower slope for young cedar saplings, flexible enough to bend without splitting. He cut only the ones growing close together, leaving the deeper root systems alive beneath the frozen soil. Instead of chopping them down cleanly, he pulled and curved them inward, weaving the green lengths through the older canopy overhead. The mountain fought him in every step. Several branches snapped loose and whipped backward hard enough to split the skin across his knuckles. One struck his cheek and opened a thin line beneath his eye. By the second day, his hands were swollen and streaked with dried blood where cedar bark had peeled them raw. Clara worked beside him without complaint. She cut marsh reeds from a frozen bog lower on the pass. She tied sections of the weave together using narrow strips of softened rawhide warmed beside the fire. At night, both of them packed damp bog moss into the openings between the branches while the wind moved above them with a long, restless howl. The first version of the roof nearly failed before it was half finished. A hard gust rolled across the ridge after midnight and tore loose an entire section of fresh weave along the western side. Vern woke to the sound of branches snapping against one another in the dark. By morning, part of the canopy hung crooked and open toward the sky, but even failure taught something useful there. The tighter woven sections held. The looser ones lifted with the wind. So Vern started over, weaving lower, denser, closer to the natural grain of the living cedar itself. 3 days later, fresh snow dusted the canopy for the first time without falling through into the shelter space below. Clara stood beneath it and looked upward through the dim green lattice. Then she spoke quietly enough that the mountain almost swallowed the words. "It's quieter under here." Jonah Reed came onto the ridge near sundown with a line of steel traps hanging from one shoulder and frost gathered deep in his beard. He had trapped the northern passes for nearly 40 years and moved through Black Elk Pass with the slow caution of a man who trusted nothing in winter, especially silence. Jonah stopped when he saw the woven canopy. For several moments he simply stared at it while the wind hissed through the trees above. Then he looked at Vern. "Either you're building something clever," he said, "or your grave." There was no mockery in his voice. Only doubt. That carried more weight. Jonah stepped carefully onto the canopy itself, testing the woven cedar with his boots. The structure bowed slightly beneath his weight, then settled without breaking. His eyes narrowed. Clara watched the old trapper glance upward toward the bent living branches, holding tension against one another. Finally, Jonah climbed back down. Without another word, he walked to his sled and pulled out an old steel-headed shovel, along with a damaged hand auger missing half its crank handle. "Had these too long to carry useless weight?" he muttered. Then his gaze returned once more to the roof overhead. Cedar bends better than pine under wet load. It was not praise, but it was the first honest respect the mountain had given Vern through another man. Once the roof held steady, Vern finally began digging into the leeward side of the ridge itself. The mountain resisted immediately. Beneath the thin topsoil lay layers of fractured shale, sharp enough to cut through gloves, followed by granite so hard the shovel rang against it like iron striking iron. Some sections crumbled easily, others refused to move at all. Worse still, pockets of half-frozen water seeped slowly through the earth whenever the afternoon temperatures rose above freezing for even an hour. The shelter deepened inch by inch. Vern carved a narrow heat trench into the floor, where colder air could settle lower than the sleeping area. He raised the bedding shelf against the rear wall and hollowed a small alcove for dry cedar wood beside the future fire pit. For several days, the system seemed to work. Then, the ridge reminded him who controlled the ground beneath his feet. A retaining edge along the western wall softened during a brief thaw and collapsed sometime before dawn. Wet earth slid into the shelter, soaking both blankets and nearly burying the bedding platform beneath freezing mud. Clara spent half the morning carrying sludge outside with a broken kettle, while Vern cut drainage channels through the floor using the damaged auger shaft. Neither of them spoke much that day. The cold became worse after sunset. Their blankets froze stiff along the edges where the moisture had soaked in. For the first time since arriving on Black Elk Pass, Clara looked at the half-finished shelter and seemed genuinely afraid, not of the wind, of staying. But sometime near midnight, Vern finally noticed something important beneath the frustration and exhaustion. The warmest part of the shelter was not the floor itself. It was the raised sleeping shelf above the drainage runoff. That lesson changed everything after that. The first hard frost silvered the ridge 3 mornings later. Vern was shaping drainage channels beneath the shelter when voices carried through the trees below. Gideon had returned, this time with Ephraim Cutter and Marshall Harlan Pike, the lawmen responsible for winter safety along the northern settlements. The 3 men stopped at the edge of the woven canopy and stared down into the half-buried structure cut into the slope. Marshall Pike's face tightened immediately. "A burrow fit for animals," he said. Ephraim laughed under his breath and kicked snow against one of the cedar supports. "Heavy, wet snow will flatten that woven mess by January." Clara stood silently near the fire pit, hands folded tightly inside her coat while the wind rolled through the upper branches overhead. Gideon looked tired more than angry. "Come back down before the first hard freeze closes the pass," he said. "You still have time." Vern climbed out from beneath the canopy, mud frozen along his boots and sleeves. "No." The answer landed flat and hard in the cold air. Marshall Pike stepped closer after that. "When the first real snowpack comes in, this place gets cleared. That's official." No one spoke for several seconds. Then Gideon looked past Vern toward the frozen ridge stretching behind him. "Father left you this land," he said quietly, "because it was already dead." The wind moved through the cedar above them with a sound like distant breathing. After Gideon left the ridge, Vern worked with the quiet intensity of a man who understood time had become another enemy. The shelter widened slowly beneath the cedar canopy. He lined the inner walls with broken shale slabs gathered from the slope, fitting them together tightly enough to hold back loose earth and redirect moisture toward the drainage trench below. Near the roofline, he split the smoke vent into two narrow channels after noticing the mountain wind pulled harder across angled openings than straight ones. Then came the sod. Layer after layer of frozen grass and drift roots were packed over the woven cedar roof until the entire structure began blending into the ridge itself. For the first time since arriving on Black Elk Pass, the shelter held warmth through the entire night. The difference was undeniable. Their blankets no longer stiffened with frost by morning. Breath no longer crystallized above their faces while they slept. But the mountain demanded payment for every improvement. Condensation formed beneath the ceiling after midnight and dripped steadily onto the packed earth floor. Some nights, the smoke failed to rise cleanly through the split vent, and instead drifted low through the chamber in thin gray ribbons that stung the eyes and settled into the lungs. The shelter was alive now, breathing, changing, learning alongside them. Late one evening, Clara pressed her hand against the shale-lined wall beside the bedding shelf. The stone held a faint trapped warmth from the fire pit below. Outside, the wind screamed across the ridge. Inside, the earth answered with silence. The freezing rain arrived without warning, late one night. No snow. No drifting wind at first. Just a hard metallic tapping against the cedar roof as ice began sealing itself over the ridge inch by inch. Vern woke to Clara coughing. Not once. Repeatedly. Violently. The shelter air had changed. Smoke hung low across the chamber in slow gray layers, trapped beneath the ceiling instead of climbing toward the split vent above. The fire pit burned weak and orange, starved for draft. Vern's head already felt heavy by the time he sat upright. His eyes watered instantly. The vent. Something had blocked the vent. He grabbed the shovel and crawled toward the entrance tunnel, while freezing rain hammered the ridge overhead. The moment he pushed outside, the mountain hit him full force. Wind slammed across the slope hard enough to stagger him sideways through the dark. Ice had formed around the vent opening exactly where the warmer smoke met the freezing rain above the roofline. The draft had nearly sealed shut. Vern dropped to his knees in the slush and clawed at the ice with bare hands because there was no time to fetch tools. Sharp frozen crust split his knuckles open almost immediately. Blood mixed with sleet across the shale capstones, while the wind tried to throw him down the slope. Inside the shelter, Clara's coughing grew weaker. That frightened him more than the storm. He tore the last blockage free with both hands. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, the draft caught. A deep, hollow pull moved through the vent tunnel beneath him. Smoke lifted sharply upward. The fire pit below suddenly flared brighter, hungry, and alive again. Vern stayed kneeling in the freezing rain for a long moment after that, breathing hard through smoke-stung lungs while blood dripped from his fingers onto the ice. That night taught him something the mountain considered important enough to nearly kill him over. In winter country, bad air killed faster than cold. Jonah Reed returned to Black Elk Pass 3 days after the freezing rainstorm with fresh fox pelts tied across his sled. He noticed the difference before he ever reached the shelter. The smoke rising from the vent no longer rolled unevenly across the trees. It climbed straight upward through the cold air in a thin, steady column. Snow had also begun collecting exactly where Vern predicted it would, drifting deep along the leeward side while the upper wind swept cleanly over the woven roof. Jonah crouched beside the entrance tunnel without speaking much. Inside, the chamber felt still. Not warm like a house, but stable. That mattered more on the ridge. The old trapper pulled a short candle from his coat pocket and lit it near the sleeping alcove. All three of them watched the flame carefully. It barely moved. No smoke swirl, no trapped draft, no hidden pull stealing heat through the chamber. Jonah studied the roof for a long moment after that. The woven cedar overhead had disappeared beneath layers of sod and driftgrass, until it looked less built than grown from the mountain itself. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "Most cabins fight the wind," he said. His eyes lifted toward the buried canopy above them. "Yours lets it pass over." By late November, the rumors began spreading through Mercer's Run faster than the cold itself. The barometer dropped so quickly that old men in the trading post stopped talking whenever they looked at it. Geese flew low across the valley in broken, uneven lines. Heavy, wet clouds gathered beyond the northern pass and stayed there for days without moving. People started preparing in the ways they understood. Extra beams were nailed beneath barn roofs. Livestock disappeared into crowded shelters. Men chopped and stacked wood until after dark, while hammers echoed across the valley from sunrise to nightfall. Up on Black Elk Pass, Vern prepared differently. He built woven drift fences beyond the shelter to redirect snow where he wanted it to collect. He buried extra cedar beneath a ground tarp lined with shale. Every outer seam in the roof was sealed with frozen moss, packed by hand into the smallest openings. The mountain had gone quiet in the way predators sometimes do before they move. The first wet snow arrived earlier than anyone expected. It came heavy, dense, half water already. Near midnight, part of the outer weave sagged under the sudden load. One living side beam twisted downward hard enough to pull several rawhide bindings loose beneath the sod covering. Vern and Clara crawled onto the roof immediately with lantern light shaking through the storm. The snow was already knee-deep. They hacked away excess drift with short, desperate swings, while freezing slush soaked through their gloves and sleeves. Vern pulled fresh cedar lengths into the damaged section and lashed them tight beneath the strained beam, using rope fibers stiff with ice. Below the ridge, Ephraim Cutter spotted their lantern moving through the storm. From a distance, the roof looked ready to collapse. He was certain the mountain had finally broken them. Then Clara slipped near the drift edge when the snow beneath her knee gave way. For one terrible second, the storm almost took her off the slope entirely. Vern caught her by the arm before the ridge could finish the decision for itself. And sometime before dawn, he understood another truth about living wood. A woven roof alone was not enough. The mountain demanded tension as much as flexibility. Then, suddenly, everything became still. No wind moved through the cedar. No branches creaked overhead. Even the animals vanished from the ridge as though something unseen had passed among them during the night. The silence spread across Black Elk Pass like a warning. Vern checked the split vent twice before sunset. He hung an extra blanket across the entrance tunnel to trap heat and leaned the shovel beside the doorway where he could reach it quickly if the drift buried them in. Clara sat quietly near the fire pit, watching the low orange light move across the shale walls. Outside, the mountain waited. "Do you think it'll hold?" she finally asked. Vern looked up toward the woven ceiling hidden beneath sod, moss, and frozen snow. "It only has to hold longer than the storm." Neither of them spoke after that. The silence beyond the shelter had become worse than the wind ever was. The iron winter arrived before dawn, not as falling snow at first, but as a white wall swallowing the ridge from one end of the pass to the other. Wind slammed into Black Elk Pass hard enough to shake the cedar canopy beneath its layers of sod and frozen moss. Wet snow followed behind it in thick, relentless sheets, packing against every surface it touched before freezing solid into crusted ice. The temperature collapsed within hours. Streams locked shut beneath gray skin. Tree limbs cracked in the darkness like rifle shots. Entire drifts shifted across the mountain under the force of the gale, and down in Mercer's Run, the old ways began failing one after another. A barn roof folded inward beneath soaked snow before noon. Men climbed onto houses with axes to hack weight from the rafters, while the wind tried to throw them into the street below. Chimneys froze closed. Smoke backed into bedrooms. Livestock died standing in crowded pens before the second night had fully passed. The storm moved faster than repairs, faster than strength, faster than pride. But beneath the ridge, inside the woven shelter buried deeper beneath every passing hour, a different world existed. The drift piling above the cedar canopy smothered the wind instead of feeding it. Sound changed first. The violent roar outside became distant and muffled beneath the growing snowpack overhead. Then the temperature stabilized. The fire trench glowed steadily through the darkness, while trapped earth warmth held close along the shale walls and raised sleeping shelf. The deeper the drift became, the less heat escaped, exactly as Vern believed it would. Ice sealed the outer layers of snow together until the shelter sat hidden beneath a frozen shell thick enough to block most of the mountain's fury from reaching them directly. Several times through the night, Vern pressed his hand against the ceiling supports, expecting movement. The woven beams held, the drift held. The mountain itself seemed to settle around them instead of against them. And somewhere beyond the storm, cabins built tall and proud continued breaking apart beneath the same weight, now protecting the little shelter hidden under the ridge. The deeper the storm buried them, the warmer the mountains seemed willing to let them remain. By the fifth day, the entrance tunnel had narrowed to little more than a crawl space packed tight with drifted snow. Vern woke before sunrise and began digging upward with the shovel resting beside the doorway. The snow above them had hardened into layers so dense they cut free in heavy blocks instead of powder. Each strike echoed dully through the buried shelter like work beneath deep water. When he finally broke through to open air, cold light flooded down the tunnel. The world outside no longer looked familiar. Mercer's Run had nearly vanished beneath the snowpack stretching across the valley floor. Barn roofs appeared as uneven white humps. Fence lines were gone entirely. Roads had disappeared under windswept drifts taller than wagons, and their shelter. It no longer resembled something built by human hands. Only a smooth white mound remained against the ridge, with a thin column of smoke rising from a single dark vent near the top. Alive, breathing. Inside, the proof surrounded them in quiet, ordinary details far stronger than words. The butter near the fire trench remained soft enough to spread. The water bucket carried only a thin skin of ice across the surface, instead of freezing solid overnight. The shale walls held faint warmth beneath the touch. Vern pressed his palms slowly against the packed earth beside the sleeping shelf, while the storm wind moved harmlessly overhead beyond layers of snow and cedar. And for the first time since arriving on Black Elk Pass, he understood something impossible to explain to men who only built against nature. The mountain had stopped trying to kill them. 2 days after the storm finally loosened its grip on the ridge, Vern saw movement through the pale white distance beyond the drift field. At first, it looked like nothing more than another shadow moving inside the blowing snow. Then the figure stumbled, collapsed, rose again. Ephraim Cutter was barely recognizable by the time he reached the shelter mound. His heavy wool coat hung torn open across one shoulder. Ice clung thick to his beard and eyebrows. One side of his face had turned gray-white from frostbite, and his eyes squinted against the light with the helpless look of a man half snowblind. He followed the smoke. That was all that brought him there. The logging bunkhouse farther down the ridge had failed on the second night of the storm. Wet snow and ice loads split the roof beams apart. Then the stovepipe froze shut. Smoke backed into the structure while wind tore through the broken rafters overhead. The mountain finished the rest. Ephraim collapsed against the entrance tunnel before he even managed to knock. Vern dragged him inside without a word. Warm air wrapped around the freezing man almost violently after the cold outside. The glow from the fire trench flickered across the shale walls, while meltwater dripped quietly from Ephraim's frozen coat onto the packed earth floor. For several long moments, he could only stare upward. At the woven ceiling, at the buried cedar beams still holding beneath the weight of the mountain above them. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded thin and broken from cold. "I kept cutting against the wind," the shelter answered with silence and steady warmth. Ephraim sat near the fire trench for a long time before speaking again. The storm had stripped something out of him, along with the feeling in his hands. "How the hell did this hold?" he finally asked. Vern looked toward the buried roof overhead where the cedar beams curved beneath layers of snow, earth, and ice without breaking. "The mountain already showed us how," he said quietly. His eyes moved toward the entrance tunnel, where the wind groaned somewhere far above them now. "We were the only fools trying to build against it." No triumph lived in the words. No satisfaction. Only exhaustion. and truth earned the hard way. Ephraim lowered his gaze after that. The same man who once laughed at the woven shelter now sat alive beneath it because the ridge had judged one idea stronger than the other. Outside, the storm still ruled the mountain. But down in the earth beneath the cedar roots, the argument was already over. 3 days later, Jonah Reed led a small rescue party onto Black Elk Pass, wearing snowshoes cut from ash wood and rawhide. No one in Mercer's Run believed they were going to find survivors. Not after the iron winter. The men carried shovels, blankets, and a narrow sled meant for bodies frozen too stiff to bend. They moved carefully through drifts that reached chest height in some places, stopping often to catch their breath in the thin cutting cold. Then Jonah saw the smoke, a thin gray line rising steadily into the pale winter sky. The men stopped where they stood. Farther ahead, half buried beneath layers of drifted snow, the shelter remained intact. Not broken, not collapsed, hidden so completely within the ridge that it resembled part of the mountain itself. And outside the entrance tunnel, Vern Whitlock was splitting frozen cedar beside a chopping block carved directly into the snowpack. Alive, unhurried, unchanged. The sound of the axe echoed sharply through the white silence, while the rescue party stared without speaking. Inside the shelter, Ephraim Cutter sat wrapped in blankets beside the fire trench, with frostbite bandaged across both hands. His presence alone explained more than words could. One of the townsmen slowly removed his gloves, as though he no longer trusted what he was seeing. Jonah stepped toward the drift-covered roof carefully. Then, without ceremony, he climbed onto it. The buried canopy did not shift, did not groan, did not sink beneath his weight. The old trapper stood there for several seconds, looking down across the white valley below before shaking his head once in disbelief. "I've trapped 40 winters," he said quietly. His eyes moved toward the snow, packed thick, over the woven shelter beneath his boots, and I never saw snow used that way. No one laughed at the ridge anymore after that. Spring reached Black Elk Pass slowly, not in warmth at first, but in sound. Water dripping beneath old snowbanks. Ravens returning to the ridge. Wind moving softer through the cedar, instead of cutting across it like a blade. The shelter remained where winter had buried it. Alive. As the snowpack receded, the woven roof slowly revealed itself again beneath the thawing layers of drift grass and frozen moss. Green cedar shoots pushed through the weave exactly where Vern had left the living branches rooted in the earth months earlier. The mountain had not crushed the structure. It had sealed it, strengthened it, hidden it inside itself. People from Mercer's Run began climbing the ridge soon after the roads reopened. At first, they came out of curiosity. Then they returned carrying notebooks, tools, rawhide cord, and questions. Vern showed them how drift fencing redirected snow instead of fighting it. He explained why windbreaks worked better when woven low and uneven rather than tall and rigid. Jonah Reed demonstrated how to test airflow using candle flame and smoke pull before sealing a shelter for winter. Even Ephraim Cutter returned, not to argue, to learn. The same logging crews that once laughed at woven roofs began building lower bunkhouses with reinforced drift walls and buried wood caches along the northern camps. Farmers copied the snow fencing to protect livestock pens from crosswinds during blizzards. Trappers started using partially buried warming shelters along long winter routes through the pass country. And through all of it, the old shelter on Black Elk Pass remained standing quietly beneath the cedar trees. People eventually gave Vern Whitlock a name, the valley remembered long after the iron winter had passed. The Ridgebinder. Not because he conquered the mountain, because he listened to it. On certain cold mornings, smoke could still be seen rising from the ridge, while the wind moved harmlessly over the buried canopy overhead. Travelers passing through Black Elk Pass would sometimes stop and stare at the strange mound built into the earth, half shelter and half living thing. Most never fully understood it. But the mountain did. The frontier never rewarded the loudest man. Only the one patient enough to notice what the mountain had already been trying to teach. What about you? Would you have trusted a shelter made from woven branches before the deadliest winter buried the mountain?